It began with a brush, a touch that lingered a beat too long. Dust motes danced in the air of the cramped storage room, the scent of old wood and his citrusy cologne making the space feel smaller than it was. Ethan and I were jammed together, wrestling with forgotten relics of a life I barely remembered. For an hour, I'd played it cool, kept it casual, or so I thought. Then my heel caught on a box corner and the world tilted. Strong hands shot out, anchoring me, his grip firm on my waist as he stopped my fall. Time stopped too. A jolt, not of fear, but something hotter, surged through me at his touch. I looked up, his face inches away, eyes searching mine, and my pulse hammered against my ribs. "You okay?" he murmured, voice low, concern etched in his brow. "Yeah, fine," I stammered, pulling back too quickly, the phantom warmth of his hand still burning on my skin. We went back to sorting, but the air had thickened. Every accidental brush of our hands, every fleeting glance now crackled with unspoken tension. By the time we were done, my cheeks burned and my nerves were frayed. "Thanks for the help," I managed, striving for lightness as we stood by the door. "Anytime," he replied, a slow curve of his lips hinting at a smile that sent my heart into overdrive. As he walked away, I knew two things with chilling certainty. I was in deep, dangerous territory, and I didn't want him to leave. Not then, not ever. When Ethan moved back into our Upper West Side brownstone, Robert, my husband, had waved it off as temporary. "Just needs to reset after the breakup," he'd mumbled, eyes glued to the Yankees' schedule, barely acknowledging the upheaval about to enter our carefully curated lives. I'd agreed, of course. What kind of stepmother would I be? But the man who walked through the door was a stranger, not the awkward teenager I vaguely recalled. Ethan was broad-shouldered, confident, with a smile that could melt the polar ice caps. Robert, predictably, was swallowed by his golf weekends and business trips, leaving me adrift in the echoing rooms with Ethan's quiet presence. It started subtly. Morning coffee, him leaning against the granite countertop in our gleaming kitchen, conversation light, meaningless. Then came offers to carry groceries, to fix the leaky faucet Robert had been meaning to get to for months. Small gestures, escalating to lingering glances, touches that held a fraction too long. And then, the storage room. Saturday morning, Robert was at some exclusive golf retreat upstate. The city apartment felt vast, empty. I decided to tackle the storage room, a black hole of forgotten memories. Gloves on, trash bag in hand, I braced myself for the dusty chaos. Ethan materialized as I wrestled with the door. "Need a hand?" His voice, warm and casual, sent a tremor through me. I hesitated. "You don't have to," I said, a traitorous part of me already hoping he would. "Nothing else going on," he shrugged, that devastating smile flashing again. "Two sets of hands are better than one." He was right, logically. I stepped back, letting him squeeze into the cramped space. Boxes teetered precariously, furniture draped in sheets like ghosts, holiday decorations gathering dust. We started sorting, the silence punctuated by the rustle of paper and the thud of discarded items. Dusty photo albums, a broken Tiffany lamp, faded linens, relics of a life that felt increasingly distant. As hours bled together, the enclosed space, the shared task began to shift something between us. It happened with the dresser. Heavy, unwieldy, I struggled to keep my grip as we edged it towards the wall. "Careful," Ethan said, stepping closer, his arm brushing mine. A spark. I froze. His touch was electric, sending a jolt straight to my core. I looked up, his face just inches from mine. "You okay?" His voice was a low rumble. "Yeah," I breathed, pulling my hand away too quickly. "I've got it." But I didn't. My foot snagged, a clumsy stumble backwards. Instinctively, Ethan moved, hands clamping onto my waist, steadying me. The dresser thumped against the wall, a muffled sound lost in the sudden pounding of my heart. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. His hands were a brand on my skin, his grip strong, sure. The air crackled. I could feel his breath on my cheek, see the flecks of gold in his irises as I looked up. Something flickered in his eyes, something I couldn't name, couldn't decipher. "You sure you're okay?" he asked again, softer this time, his voice a husky whisper. "I'm fine," I managed, my own voice barely audible. He didn't release me. His hands lingered, a fraction of a second too long before he stepped back, expression suddenly unreadable. After that, everything shifted. The air in the room was thick, charged, an unspoken tension humming between us. We worked in silence, movements deliberate, careful. But every brush of skin, every accidental eye contact, sent a jolt through me. By the time the storage room was transformed, the clutter banished. Replaced by neat stacks of labeled bins, I was a mess of frayed nerves. I could barely focus on the clean space. All I could think about was his hands on my waist, the intensity in his eyes, the way my body had responded, a visceral reaction I couldn't ignore. "Thanks for helping," I said again, by the door, trying to sound normal, casual. "Anytime," he replied, that faint smile returning, quickening my pulse. I watched him walk away, his steps slow, deliberate. The apartment suddenly felt too vast, too silent, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, I didn't want him to leave. Not then, not ever. That night, sleep was a battlefield of replays. The storage room, every detail etched in my mind. The heat of his hands, the intensity of his gaze, the frantic rhythm of my heart. Ridiculous, I told myself. He was my stepson. This was wrong. But the thoughts kept surging back, insistent, undeniable, and the more I tried to push them away, the more I realized with a terrifying thrill that I didn't want them to stop. Morning dawned, sharp and bright through the Manhattan skyline. I told myself it was just a moment, a fleeting lapse in judgment, the confined space, fatigue playing tricks on my mind. But then I walked into the kitchen and saw him, Ethan, leaning against the coffee machine, barefoot, in a worn t-shirt and sweatpants, casual, domestic, and I knew, with a sickening lurch of my stomach, that it wasn't just a moment. "Morning," he said, voice low, casual, but something in his eyes made my breath catch. "Morning," I replied, forcing my voice to be steady as I poured coffee, hands trembling slightly. The silence wasn't new, but it felt different now, weighted, charged. I could feel his eyes on me as I stirred sugar, too much sugar, into my cup. "Sleep well?" he asked, leaning back against the counter, casually blocking my escape route. "Fine," I lied, too quickly. Sleep had been a distant memory, replaced by the ghost of his touch, the memory of his eyes searching mine. "Good," he said, a flicker of a smile playing on his lips, something knowing in his expression, as if he could see straight through the carefully constructed facade. My cheeks flushed, a betraying heat. I turned away, retreating to the dining table, coffee clattering in its saucer, pretending to read something, anything, on my phone. Even with my back to him, I felt the weight of his gaze, the tension in the air thickening with every passing second. Days blurred into a strained dance of avoidance. Errands, chores, anything to keep me away, to create distance. But distance was an illusion in our shared space. He was always there. In the kitchen, on the couch, in the hallway. Every accidental encounter, every shared breath felt like a test of my dwindling self-control. One evening, Robert was predictably absent, lost in another golf tournament. Ethan and I were alone in the living room, the vast space suddenly suffocating. He sprawled on the couch, flipping channels on the TV, the flickering light painting shadows across his face. I sat stiffly in an armchair, a book open in my lap, words blurring into meaningless shapes. "You don't have to sit all the way over there," he said, voice laced with a teasing note. "I'm comfortable," I replied, eyes fixed on the page, not a single word registering. He chuckled softly, the sound vibrating through the silence, sending a shiver down my spine. "Suit yourself." Minutes stretched, heavy and thick, silence punctuated only by the drone of the TV. I could feel his presence like a physical pull, drawing me closer, a magnetic force I was desperately fighting. My book remained untouched, my thoughts a chaotic loop of the storage room, his touch, his eyes. Finally, I couldn't bear it anymore. Book snapped shut, heart hammering against my ribs. I stood abruptly. "I think I'll head to bed," my voice too loud in the quiet room. Ethan sat up, gaze locking onto mine. "Wait," he said, his tone soft but insistent. I hesitated, hand gripping the back of the chair for support. I looked at him, and the raw intensity in his eyes stole my breath. "Can we talk?" he asked, standing, taking a step closer. "About what?" My voice barely a whisper. "About what happened," he said simply, closing the distance between us. "In the storage room." I froze, pulse racing, a frantic hummingbird trapped in my chest. "Nothing happened," I said, too quickly, the lie brittle and unconvincing even to my own ears. He stepped closer, invading my space, his hand brushing against mine, sending a shockwave up my arm. "That's not true," he said, voice low and steady, "and you know it." I looked away, chest tight, air thin. "Ethan, we can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, his hand now covering mine, his fingers tightening around mine. "Why are you so afraid to admit what you're feeling?" His words hit me like a blow, stealing my breath. He was right. Fear, a cold, suffocating wave, washed over me. Fear of what this meant, of where it could lead, of the devastating consequences. "Nathan," I said finally, my voice trembling, "this isn't right. You're my—" "Don't," he cut me off, his tone firm but gentle. "Don't say it like that. I'm not a kid, Victoria. I know what I'm doing, and I know you feel it too." He reached for my other hand, his thumbs tracing circles on my knuckles. And when I looked up at him, the vulnerability in his eyes shattered the last of my defenses. Before I could think, before I could reason, I closed the remaining space between us, my lips crashing against his in a kiss that was raw, desperate, and achingly overdue. He responded instantly, arms wrapping around me, pulling me impossibly closer. The kiss deepened, a hungry, consuming fire. The living room dissolved around us. The couch became our world, our sanctuary. Lost in each other, his hands were everywhere, back, waist, thighs, exploring with a feverish urgency that left me breathless. It was raw, intense, and for the first time in years, I felt truly, terrifyingly alive. No hesitation, no second guessing, just the overwhelming need to be closer, to feel his skin against mine, to let go of everything else, and just be. When it was over, we lay tangled on the couch, breath ragged, skin slick with sweat. Ethan's hand traced lazy circles on my back, and I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "Are you okay?" he murmured, voice soft, laced with a concern that felt achingly real. I nodded, eyes closed, a single tear tracing a path down my temple. "Yeah," I whispered, voice barely audible. "I'm okay." But even as the word left my lips, the reality of what we had just done crashed down. Guilt, heavy and suffocating, fear, a cold knot in my stomach, the weight of our transgression. It was only the beginning. We had crossed a line, irrevocably, and nothing would ever be the same. The morning after, the apartment was eerily silent. Ethan was gone when I woke, leaving behind an empty coffee cup in the sink and a note on the kitchen counter. "See you later." Casual words, but his handwriting sent a jolt through me. I stared at the note, the mundane message a stark contrast to the earth-shattering night before, replaying everything, the heat of his skin, the weight of his body, his whispered name on my lips. It had felt so right, so inevitable in the darkness. Now, in the stark light of day, all I could see were the risks, the consequences, the tangled web we had woven. Yet, a treacherous part of me didn't care. A part of me craved more. The days that followed were a dizzying dance of stolen moments and secret glances. We moved carefully around Robert, a phantom presence in our lives, blissfully oblivious, lost in his world of golf and business deals. Ethan and I became masters of subterfuge, weaving excuses to be alone. A trip to Fairway became a clandestine rendezvous, hands brushing in the car, fingers intertwining, a silent promise that sent my heart soaring. Late-night movies in the living room, Robert long asleep, ended with stolen kisses in the shadows, his lips trailing down my neck, my breath catching in my throat as I fought to stay silent. The thrill was intoxicating, a dangerous, addictive rush. Every touch, every whispered word felt like a rebellion against the carefully constructed life I'd been living for so long. With Ethan, I felt seen, desired, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, but the secrecy was a constant, gnawing anxiety. Every time we were together, the fear lurked, a shadow at the edge of my awareness. The potential fallout, the devastating consequences if we were discovered. Yet I wouldn't stop. One afternoon, Robert announced another golf weekend, a retreat with his cronies in the Hamptons. As soon as he was gone, the apartment seemed to breathe, lighter, freer. The walls themselves seemed to relax, giving us tacit permission to shed the pretense. Ethan found me on the terrace, tending to my roses, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "You've been avoiding me," he said, voice teasing, but with an undercurrent of seriousness. "Been busy," I replied, the excuse flimsy even to my own ears. He stepped closer, hands sliding into his pockets, watching me, his gaze intense. "We don't have to keep doing this, you know, pretending like nothing's happening." I straightened up, wiping my hands on my gardening gloves, my heart hammering. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," he said, closing the space between us, "that I don't want to pretend anymore." His words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. I opened my mouth to speak, to protest, to reason, but before I could, he reached for me, his hand sliding around my waist, pulling me close. His lips found mine, a kiss that was soft at first, then deepened, insistent, demanding, and I melted into him, the roses, the city skyline, the weight of the world fading away. That weekend was ours. With Robert gone, we didn't have to hide, didn't have to steal glances or whisper secrets. Lazy mornings in bed, sunlight filtering through the blinds, his arms a warm, comforting weight around me. Afternoons spent wandering the apartment, exploring the intimacy that had bloomed between us, finding new ways to connect, to touch, to be. One evening, we found ourselves in the kitchen, a domestic tableau that felt both surreal and utterly right. Cooking dinner together, a simple pasta dish, the aroma of garlic and basil filling the air. Ethan stood behind me, arms circling my waist, reaching around to stir the sauce on the stove. His breath warm against my neck, I leaned back into him, savoring the quiet intimacy, the easy comfort. "You know," he murmured, his lips brushing my ear, "this feels right." I turned to face him, hands resting on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my palms. "It does," I admitted, voice soft, vulnerable, "but that doesn't mean it's easy." "It doesn't have to be easy," he said, his fingers tracing the curve of my cheek, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "It just has to be worth it." But as much as I desperately wanted to believe him, the reality of our situation loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon. The more time we spent together, the deeper we fell, the harder it became to maintain the fragile facade of normalcy. Every ring of the phone, every unexpected knock at the door sent a jolt of panic through me. What if Robert called? What if he came home early? What if he somehow knew? One night, tangled in the sheets, the weight of our secret pressing down on me, I voiced the fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks. "What if he finds out?" I whispered, voice barely audible in the darkness. Ethan propped himself up on one elbow, his expression serious, his eyes searching mine. "Then we deal with it," he said simply, his voice firm, unwavering. "It's not that simple," I said, chest tightening, fear constricting my breath. "This could destroy everything." He reached for my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles over my knuckles. "Victoria," he said, his voice steady, reassuring, "I'm not afraid of the truth. Are you?" His question hung in the air, a challenge, a confrontation, and for a long moment I didn't know how to answer. Because the truth was, I was terrified. Terrified of the truth, of what it would mean, of what it would cost us. The first close call arrived a week later. Robert, unexpectedly home early from a business meeting, walked into the apartment just as Ethan and I were in the kitchen, standing a fraction too close, a silent intimacy radiating between us. I pulled away sharply, cheeks burning, as Robert's gaze flicked between us, his brow furrowed. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone light, too light, but with an unmistakable edge of suspicion. "Just making lunch," I stammered, forcing a smile that felt brittle and false. Robert nodded, but his eyes lingered on me, too long, too intensely. My stomach churned with a cold dread. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, scrutinized. The secrecy, once thrilling, was now suffocating. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word between Ethan and me felt weighted, dangerous. The intoxicating rush had morphed into a heavy burden, pressing down on my chest. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was only a matter of time before the carefully constructed facade crumbled. But even as the guilt and fear intensified, so did my feelings for Ethan. He was everything Robert wasn't. Kind, attentive, passionate. With him, I felt seen, alive. Despite the overwhelming risks, I couldn't bring myself to let go, because no matter how wrong it was, it felt right. And I wasn't ready to give that up. Not yet. The weight of our secret was crushing me, a physical ache in my chest. What had started as a thrilling rebellion now felt like a ticking time bomb. Robert wasn't blind. His questions, the way his eyes lingered, the subtle shifts in his demeanor, he was sensing something. I knew it was only a matter of time before he pieced it all together, and the fear of that moment haunted my waking hours, invaded my sleep. It all came to a head one evening during one of Robert's rare dinners at home. He'd insisted on a family meal, a performance of reconnection, though his eyes were distant, his attention elsewhere. The three of us sat around the mahogany dining table, the air thick with unspoken tension, the silence heavy enough to cut with a knife. "So, Ethan," Robert said, slicing into his steak with unnecessary force, the clatter of silverware echoing in the strained silence. "How's the job hunt coming along?" Ethan, unusually quiet all evening, glanced up, jaw tight, eyes guarded. "It's fine," he said curtly, voice clipped. "Got a couple of leads." Robert leaned back in his chair, his gaze narrowing, a predatory glint in his eyes. Leads, huh? You've been here for months now. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for the perfect opportunity and start doing something useful. Ethan's hand tightened around his fork, knuckles white. I saw a flicker of anger, raw and dangerous in his eyes. I'm working on it, he said, tone clipped, barely controlled. Doesn't seem like it, Robert shot back, the polite facade crumbling, revealing the sharp edges beneath. You spend most of your time lounging around the apartment. Maybe it's time to start contributing. That's enough, I interjected, voice sharper, louder than I intended. Both men turned to me, startled, their expressions mirroring each other in their surprise. There's no need to be so harsh, I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. Robert's gaze lingered on me, too long, too intense, his brow furrowing. I'm just trying to help, he said, but his tone was anything but helpful. The rest of the meal passed in a strained, suffocating silence. By the time it was over, I felt like I couldn't breathe. Ethan disappeared upstairs, a storm cloud radiating off him. Robert retreated to his study, slamming the door shut behind him, leaving me alone to clear the wreckage of our family dinner. I stood at the sink, hands trembling, scrubbing dishes with excessive force, trying to push down the rising tide of panic in my chest. Later that night, I found Ethan on the terrace, leaning against the railing, gazing out at the city lights. Moonlight bathed his face, softening the harsh lines of tension etched around his mouth. The rigid set of his shoulders told me he was still simmering, still replaying the ugly exchange with Robert. Are you okay? I asked softly, stepping beside him, the night air cool on my skin. He didn't look at me, gaze fixed on the distant horizon. I'm fine. You don't seem fine, I pressed gently, reaching out, my fingers brushing his arm. Talk to me. He let out a bitter laugh, finally turning to face me, his eyes dark, shadowed in the moonlight. What's the point? It's not like anything's going to change. Things can change, I said, the words hollow, unconvincing even to myself. We just have to be careful. Ethan's eyes darkened further, his expression hardening. Careful? Is that all this is to you? Something to hide? That's not what I meant, I said quickly, but he didn't let me finish. Then what did you mean? He demanded, stepping closer, his voice raw with emotion. Because I'm tired of sneaking around, Victoria. I'm tired of pretending like this doesn't matter. It does matter, I said, voice breaking, tears pricking at my eyes. But this isn't just about us, Ethan. There are other people involved, other lives. He shook his head, frustration evident in every line of his body. Other people? You mean Robert? The man who barely notices you? Who spends more time on the golf course than he does with you? The man who doesn't even see you? His words were a brutal, painful truth, a punch to the gut. Tears welled in my eyes, spilling over. He's my husband, I said softly, the words a plea, a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of order, of rightness. Whether you like it or not, he's my husband. And what about me? Ethan asked, his voice trembling, raw pain lacing every syllable. What am I to you, Victoria? Just a distraction? A mistake? The raw vulnerability in his voice broke something inside me. Before I could think, before I could reason, I reached for him, my hands cupping his face, thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to stream down his cheeks. You're not a mistake, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. You could never be a mistake. For a long moment, we just stood there, the weight of the unspoken truth hanging heavy in the night air, and then he kissed me. His lips fierce, desperate, clinging to mine as if he was trying to hold on to something precious, something he knew he was about to lose. I kissed him back, pouring everything I couldn't say, everything I was afraid to feel, into that single desperate moment. But when we finally broke apart, breathless, hearts pounding, the cold, hard reality of our situation crashed down around us, shattering the fragile illusion of our stolen world. The breaking point came the next day. Robert had invited Martha, his old friend, over for lunch. Martha, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, a woman who had always made me uneasy. From the moment she arrived, I felt her watching me, her gaze too knowing, lingering just a fraction too long on Ethan and me whenever we were in the same room. You two seem close, she remarked casually as we sat in the living room after lunch, her eyes flicking between Ethan and me, a subtle, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. It's nice to see a family getting along so well. Her words were innocent enough on the surface, but the way she said them, the pointed emphasis, sent a chill down my spine. I forced a smile, trying to ignore the knowing glint in her eyes, but I could feel my carefully constructed composure slipping, fraying at the edges. Later, While I was in the kitchen, clearing the lunch dishes, Martha approached me, her movements surprisingly quiet. "Victoria," she said, her tone low, firm, devoid of the earlier casual pleasantries. "I don't mean to pry, but is there something going on between you and Ethan?" The blood drained from my face, leaving me cold, clammy. I turned to her, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. "Of course not," I said too quickly, too vehemently, the denial tumbling out before I could even think. "Why? Why would you even suggest that?" She raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical, unconvinced. "I'm not blind, Victoria. The way you look at him, the way he looks at you, it's not exactly subtle." I opened my mouth to protest, to deny, to fabricate some plausible explanation, but no words came. Martha's gaze softened slightly, a flicker of something akin to pity in her eyes. She sighed, a long, drawn-out breath. "Whatever it is you're doing," she said, her voice quiet but insistent, "you need to stop, before it's too late." Her words echoed in my head, a chilling prophecy haunting me for the rest of the day. I knew she was right. Stopping was the only sensible, rational course of action. But the thought of walking away from Ethan, of returning to the empty shell of my life with Robert, felt like a slow, agonizing death. Yet, the fear of what would happen if we didn't stop, the inevitable catastrophic fallout, was even greater. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring up at the darkened ceiling, Robert's soft snores a constant, irritating counterpoint to the turmoil raging in my mind. Guilt, fear, longing, a toxic cocktail swirling within me. I knew something had to give. We couldn't continue down this path, not without destroying everything, everyone, in the process. The truth was inevitable, and I wasn't sure, not at all sure, if I was ready for the explosion when it finally detonated. The day it all imploded started like any other. The apartment was quiet, the air thick with a suffocating stillness. Robert had left early for another golf outing, another escape from our reality. Ethan had gone out to run errands, or so he said. I sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty coffee cup cooling in front of me, staring blankly at the untouched toast on my plate. Martha's words, sharp and accusatory, replayed in my mind a relentless loop of guilt and fear. "You need to stop before it's too late." But stopping felt impossible. Ethan and I had gone too far, crossed too many lines, to simply turn back. Yet, the weight of our deception was crushing me, a suffocating pressure. The walls were closing in, the inevitability of exposure looming, a dark storm gathering on the horizon. I didn't know it would happen that day. I didn't know that everything I was desperately trying to hold together, to contain, would shatter into a million irreparable pieces before the sun even began to set. It started with a phone call. Robert returned home earlier than expected, his mood dark, thunderous. He set his golf bag down in the entryway with a heavy thud, the sound echoing through the tense silence. "Martha called me," he said, his voice clipped, devoid of any warmth. My heart plummeted, a sickening lurch in my stomach. "Oh," I managed, trying to keep my voice neutral, to mask the sudden surge of panic. "She mentioned that you two had an interesting conversation the other day," he continued, his gaze fixed on me, unblinking, unnerving. "Care to explain?" I froze, my mind racing, scrambling for a plausible denial, a believable lie. "It was nothing," I stammered, too quickly, too desperately. "Just small talk." Robert's eyes narrowed, his gaze hardening. "Funny, because she seemed to think there was something going on between you and Ethan." The room seemed to tilt, the floorboards swaying beneath my feet. My throat tightened, constricting, making it impossible to speak. I opened my mouth, a silent gasp for air to deny it, to fabricate some flimsy excuse, but the words wouldn't come. They were trapped, choked down by the weight of the truth. "Victoria," Robert said, his tone dangerously calm, deceptively soft, "I want the truth. What's been happening in this apartment?" Before I could answer, before I could utter a single word, the front door opened. Ethan walked in, carrying grocery bags, his usual easy smile faltering, fading as he took in the scene. He froze, mid-step, his gaze darting between Robert and me, assessing the charged atmosphere, the palpable tension crackling in the air. I could see the realization dawning in his eyes, the understanding of what was happening, of what was about to happen. "What's going on?" Ethan asked, his voice wary, cautious. I was just about to ask the same thing, Robert said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. With a barely contained rage, his eyes narrowing as he turned to his son. Care to enlighten me, Ethan? What exactly has been happening between you and my wife? Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. For a long, agonizing moment, he didn't respond, the silence stretching, thick with unspoken accusations, with the weight of our betrayal. Then, he stepped forward, his shoulders squared, his gaze meeting Robert's head-on, unwavering. "You already know, don't you?" he said, his voice steady, surprisingly calm, in stark contrast to the storm brewing within Robert. Robert's face contorted, his features twisting with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He let out a bitter, humorless laugh, shaking his head in slow motion. "You're not even going to deny it? Unbelievable. I'm not going to lie to you," Ethan said, his tone firm, resolute. "I care about her, Robert. I love her." The words hung in the air, heavy, explosive, like a verbal grenade detonating in the confined space. I felt my knees weaken, the room spinning. Robert turned to me, his face a mask of fury, disbelief, and a deep, wounded betrayal. "Is that true?" he demanded, his voice raw, shaking with emotion. I couldn't speak. The truth was etched on my face, undeniable, inescapable. Robert saw it. He saw the confirmation of his worst fears reflected in my eyes. He let out a sharp, humorless laugh again, shaking his head, a gesture of utter disbelief, of profound disillusionment. "Unbelievable," he repeated, his voice rising, cracking with pain and fury. "My wife and my son. How long has this been going on?" "Robert, please," I choked out, my voice trembling, tears streaming down my face. "It's not—" "Don't," he snapped, cutting me off, his voice like a whip. "Don't try to justify this. Don't try to make this into something it's not." Ethan stepped closer, his jaw set, his eyes locked on Robert's. "This isn't just some fling," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "We didn't plan for this to happen, but it did, and I'm not going to apologize for how I feel." Robert's fist clenched, his knuckles white, and for a terrifying moment I thought he was going to strike Ethan, to lash out in blind rage. But instead he turned back to me, his voice trembling, choked with fury and pain. "Get out!" he said, the words spat out like venom. "What?" I asked, my heart sinking, a cold dread washing over me. "Both of you!" he roared, his voice rising to a deafening crescendo. "Get out of my apartment, now!" The drive to Ethan's Brooklyn apartment was a silent, agonizing blur. I sat in the passenger seat, numb, hands trembling uncontrollably, staring out the window at the city lights, a million pinpricks of indifference. My mind was a chaotic whirlwind of emotions. Guilt, shame, anger, and a deep, aching sadness, a profound sense of loss. I had known this day would come, had dreaded it, had tried to prepare myself, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the raw, brutal reality of it. When we arrived, Ethan helped me carry my bags inside. The apartment was small, sparsely furnished, a stark contrast to the opulent Upper West Side brownstone I had shared with Robert. But it was quiet, blessedly quiet, and for the first time in hours I felt like I could finally breathe, even if that breath was shallow and ragged. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, his voice soft, tentative, laced with concern. I nodded, a small, jerky movement, though it was a lie. I was anything but okay. I don't know what happens now," I whispered, the words barely audible. He stepped closer, his hand resting gently, reassuringly on my shoulder, a familiar comfort in the midst of the chaos. "We figure it out," he said, his voice low, steady, unwavering. "Together." I looked at him, searching his face, desperately seeking reassurance, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. He looked so sure, so determined, so unwavering in his conviction. But I wasn't. I wasn't sure of anything anymore. I didn't know if I had the strength, the resilience to rebuild my life from the ashes of everything I had so carelessly destroyed. The days that followed were a disorienting blur. Ethan and I tried to establish a new routine, a semblance of normalcy in his cramped apartment. But the weight of what had happened, the wreckage we had left behind, hung over us like a perpetual storm cloud, casting a long, dark shadow over everything. Robert refused to answer my calls, ignored my texts, effectively erasing me from his life. And I couldn't blame him. I had betrayed him in the most profound, unforgivable way imaginable, and I didn't know if he could ever forgive me, or if I even deserved his forgiveness. Ethan, for his part, remained steadfast, a constant presence in the swirling chaos of my life. He was my anchor, my lifeline, always there with a reassuring word, a comforting touch, a silent promise of support. But I could see the strain in his eyes, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way the guilt, the weight of our shared transgression, was slowly eating away at him too. One evening, as we sat on the worn couch in his living room, the silence heavy between us, I turned to him, my voice trembling, barely above a whisper. Do you think we made a mistake?" He looked at me, his expression unreadable, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Do you?" I hesitated, my chest tightening, a familiar ache spreading through my heart. "I don't know," I admitted, the words raw, honest, vulnerable. "I don't know if I can live with what we've done." Ethan reached for my hand, his grip firm, warm, gentle. "We can't change the past, Victoria," he said, his voice quiet, resolute. "But we can decide what we do next." The months that followed were some of the hardest, most isolating of my life. I moved into a small, anonymous studio apartment in the village, needing space, desperately needing solitude, to try and piece together the shattered fragments of my existence, to figure out who I was, what I was, without Robert, without Ethan, without the comfortable, predictable life I had known for so many years. Ethan and I stayed in touch, occasional phone calls, infrequent, carefully orchestrated meetings. But the white-hot intensity of our affair, the desperate urgency of our connection had inevitably faded, diluted by the harsh realities of our choices, the weight of the consequences. In the quiet solitude of my new life, surrounded by unpacked boxes and the ghosts of my past, I found myself reflecting, endlessly, relentlessly, on everything that had happened. The affair with Ethan, the catastrophic fallout, the shattering of my marriage. It had been a catalyst, a destructive force that had ripped apart the carefully constructed facade of my life, forcing me to confront the uncomfortable truths I had long ignored, the emptiness at the core of my marriage, the parts of myself I had buried, neglected, forgotten. It wasn't easy. The process of self-examination, of confronting my own complicity in the unraveling of my life was painful, wrenching, often unbearable, but it was necessary. In the desolate landscape of my broken life, I slowly, painstakingly began to rebuild. I realized with a clarity that surprised me that what I needed most, what I craved more than anything, wasn't a relationship, wasn't romantic love, wasn't the validation of another person. It was a chance to heal, to grow, to find myself again, to redefine my own happiness on my own terms. And while I couldn't possibly know what the future held for me, for Ethan, for Robert, for any of us, for the first time in years, I felt a fragile flicker of hope, a tentative sense that I was finally on the right path. A solitary path, perhaps, but mine and mine alone.